Long ago at a meeting, when someone was giving a long winding welcome address, a friend remarked that welcome notes must be like mini skirt, long enough to cover the essentials, but short enough to be interesting. I haven't forgotten these comments. So I'm going to be extra careful and keep mine micro mini size. On behalf of ABN and Noita, I extend a very warm welcome to all of you who have spared the time to be here for this webinar. Considering what occupies our mind space on Saturday mornings, we have tried to keep up our schedule well pruned and sharply focused on giving you a primer on new normal strategies for SME business sector. Let me introduce you to the speaker today, Mr. Nizar Jamal. Nizar Jamal is our distinguished alumnus from the 1987 batch, Electrical and Electronic Department. He holds a master's degree in computer science from the University of California and University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee. He also holds a management degree from IIM Bangalore. He is currently the Chief Technology Officer of Maxwell Group, an intellectual property management software and solutions provider based at Florida in the US. Nizar brings with him a rich experience in the software, security, telecommunication, marketing, publishing, legal and financial services industries in India, US and Europe. Nizar was the CTO at Typhoon, a banking security solution provider, served as the managing director of client-facing technologies at UBS Bank in Switzerland, where he was responsible for mobile and social platforms across the UBS. This apart, he was co-founder of Impulses, a digital publishing solution provider. He has also varied experience with a lot of startups around the San Francisco Bay Area. Welcome you all once again. Over to you, Nizar.
Thanks, Gopi. Thanks for having me and requesting that I actually speak to the group here. Consider it a privilege. I don't think I have. I think there are a lot of other people who have plenty of experience that can be shared and probably more relevant to this team than mine. But my experience has been primarily with small and medium-sized company, except for UBS. And in a lot of different sectors. So when it's technology, I think I have a range of experience in different industries that I can share. The topic that I chose was digital transformation, and it was kind of interesting to listen to Simon's presentation from last week, where I think he ended saying that digital transformation, digitalization of agricultural industry is something that needs to actually happen in order to kind of, for us to compete with China and actually become a lot more competitive in our industries as we go forward. So I'm just going to give you my perspective. I think those of you that know me from Annamalai would be very surprised that I actually ended up doing quite a bit in doing a lot more education. I think I did 9 years after Annamalai that I actually learned. In Annamalai, I was busy fooling around, but since then I've kind of picked up a few experiences along the way and just want to share that with you guys. Right? So it's I'm going to tell from my perspective what I've seen so far in digital transformation and how COVID and the pandemic actually is accelerating some of those changes, right? So just to give a brief, I have experience in computer software industry, that is where we're creating tools for developing applications. So this was 80s, late 90s, early 90s, where we were actually building applications with computers and we needed tools to generate applications. So this is like for the people that are know the computer industry, it's Oracle Forms and Gupta SQL Windows and all those were the ones that were in that space. And after that, I did some work in the telecom industry. And again, telecom industry was going through deregulation at that time in the US, where AT&T was broken up into Baby Bells, and the Baby Bells were actually broken up, and we had a lot more the cell phone vendors coming up, and the first cell phones were coming up in the 90s, and we were actually working with a lot of the cell phone providers and the new telecom providers to create their network operations center, how they actually look at the entire network and see what kind of faults are happening and how they can actually provide the services to their customers. So brand new industry, deregulated. There was quite a bit of learning in that industry in terms of what we could do for the consumers as we kind of made cell phones and mobile phones more prevalent. I did some work with e-commerce after that in the dot-com boom. This was, where eyeballs and, millions of people coming to the website would suddenly translate to money. It didn't, but we learned a lot and we spent a lot of money doing that stuff. But what we ended up replacing was actually, I know this used to be, we used to get these yellow pages. I don't think it even gets delivered in India anymore, the telephone directory. So in the US, we used to have yellow pages and white pages, which doesn't get delivered anymore. But this was kind of one of those services for lead generation. So if you wanted to find a service or a product, plumber or electrician, you actually look up the white pages in the 90s. And then, how do you actually do the equivalent of that in the first .com came up? That's what we were doing with e-commerce and lead generation, the first .com boom. That company is still around. It's called Respond. But again, we were kind of the quote unquote reverse eBay. We were trying to see something where you would put in a request and get responses to your request as you were for the services that you're interested in. We then did a bunch of stuff in SSL VPN. And again, this is, right now when we do virtual private network, at one point in time, it used to be, physical network lines that you had to provision in order to get a VPN going. And then it became software, but software that you had to install on a computer to actually make that happen. And then the company I was with before I left the Bay Area, called Muleterrace, which got acquired by NetScreen, and then Juniper, was created the space for SSL VPN. So you could actually create a VPN to resources behind a corporate firewall without having any physical equipment. You could just do it with your browser, right? After that, I came to India in 2003, and I did in publishing. There was a lot of, this was right after the .com bust, and so a lot of the publishers had spent a lot of money putting up websites and losing a lot of money doing that. So there was not a lot of interest in creating content electronically. And what we ended up doing with this company, which is again still around at about 600, 700 people now, which I co-founded. We used Amazon Web Services in 2007. This was when Jeff Bezos was pitching Amazon Web Services as a way for us to do heavy lifting and not have infrastructure. And what we ended up doing, which was kind of very interesting, was we created a portal where a publisher could create their own website without paying us a lot of money, right? So we reduced the barrier to what it creates to create a website where you could sell to libraries, you could sell to individuals, you could sell to companies, very similar to, Safari, O'Reilly, if you guys have used that. So Elsevier actually wrote a global contract with us and still does, where if they want to put a portal up in Korea or Brazil, they actually use our platform to make that available. So it was kind of an interesting space where we were using cloud-based systems at that point in time in 2007, way before cloud was a general term, to create sites. And then I spent a little time in financial services. I'd never done financial services before, but UBS was the first financial services company. It was a very interesting experience because for the first time I actually was on the other end buying software as opposed to selling software, because up until then I was selling software and solutions, and at UBS I was actually buying it, and it was a fairly large budget. Right, UBS technology budget runs in the billions every year, right? They wanted somebody who would do mobile across all of UBS. So this was Swiss Bank, wealth management Asia, world, global asset management, investment bank, and wealth management America, so different business units. it was a very interesting experience because, you know, when you get to a large company with about 64, 70,000 employees, there's a lot of politics involved in terms of how things get done. And so one of the things that I kind of got to do at UBS was to help them understand that, you know, you can actually be fast, even if you're a large company. So I created a new unit for mobile, and we actually got, from the time we talked to the business till the app went on the App Store, about 3 months, 4 months. So UBS had not seen speed like that. They didn't think that, you know, fast companies could be that fast. And it was really not, there was not a whole lot that, you know, I really did other than enable, you know, the different stakeholders to make sure that, you know, their viewpoint was available, right? So that's, again, a slightly different perspective to how you can be fast and agile in a large organization context and in new market areas, and how we can actually transform financial services and be and provide services quickly to your members, your customers. So in financial services for a while. I actually came back and I still am involved with Typhoon. Typhoon actually does mobile banking, online banking, voice banking for small financial institutions in the US. I'm still involved with them, but it was interesting in Typhoon after I came back from UBS to work on cybersecurity. So I actually moved back to the US from India because we were doing work for three-letter intelligence community agencies, and they required US citizens domiciled in the US to actually do some work. So it wasn't enough that I was a US citizen in India. I had to be domiciled in the US, and so I had to come to the US for that. So that was one of the reasons I actually came over to the US at that point. But it was, we were doing cybersecurity for hardware-based cybersecurity. Very, very interesting product, and there's a lot of applications in the next generation. So in the supply chain, DARPA. So the problem is if you're building an aircraft carrier, right, which has billions of components, how do you know that the component that you're putting in there is authentic? Right. So DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, the same guys that created the internet, they have a project called DARPA Shield, which is for the supply chain to make sure that you can actually say which component you're actually putting in the thing, which will probably come up into the market maybe in another 5 to 7 years. That project was actually, other than being involved there, I didn't have much to do with it, but it was actually done with Typhoon. So very interesting kind of areas that we work on in security. It's how do you make sure that the components you could actually trace the components. So just as an example, in Asia, there's a lot of repurpose, devices. So if you have a device and you put it in the device graveyard, people actually take all the components and create new they replace, repair phones with existing devices and existing phones that they scavenge parts. But it becomes a problem for some of the providers of the devices. So Qualcomm, for example, loses something like a few billion a year based on just scavenged parts not being authentic, right? So it's a problem that they want to actually resolve. That's something we did in financial services. What I'm doing right now is in legal. Legal's, again, very interesting because it's one of the few areas that is still not transformed digitally. So if you're writing a contract today, rental contract, purchase contract, if you're writing a contract with your peer, that you're writing a business contract, you would actually write paper-based contracts. So the whole promise for smart contracts and Ethereum and the can actually have enforceable smart contracts is to see if that can actually be done automatically, right? So you don't need to write contracts that need to be you can potentially enforce some of those terms automatically. We're currently working only in the intellectual property space, but that's kind of my background and my perspective in coming into in digital transformation. So there's a little joke going around in Twitter and LinkedIn about, who actually leads digital transformation in your company, right? And so the CEO does it, the CTO does it, or COVID-19. So that is really the whole context in the rest of this talk, right? Is to say, while we might have done digital transformation in different industries in different ways, and has been taken up by at different speeds, right, in different industries. COVID and the pandemic has actually accelerated it quite a bit. I'm sure each one of you, as you're running into your organization or running into how you get your team to do work, are running into the same problem. Very similar to this, we have a lot of virtual meetings and how things happen. So I'll touch upon some of the experiences that I have based on that going forward. But it is true that the pandemic has actually accelerated quite a bit of the digital transformation effort, just because it was a necessity now. It's not something that you do at your own pace. You have to kind of compete, right? So just to see what, just as a state of what digital is around the world, it's kind of interesting that more than half the population are using even social media, right? So if you look at the population of the world, at about 7.7 billion, about 55% urbanized, that is only urban areas, you still have 5.6 unique mobile users, right, that across the world. So you're getting close to 66% penetration there. Internet users about 60%, close to 60% penetration. Social media is about 50% penetration. So what this means is, as we all know, across the world, everybody is connected, and we have the mobile saturation. There's a next level of growth, which is IoT devices, but we'll leave that aside for right now. But we just look at digital adoption right now, just as mobile. There's quite a bit that we can actually assume as base substrate that's common across everything, right? In that context, then, if everybody has internet connection, or most people that you're interested in reaching have internet connection, and they have mobile devices and smartphones, and the question is, what is digital transformation? What do you have to do in your industry to actually make that work, right? So typically, there's a whole bunch of different things in digital transformation. I'm going to kind of leave that aside and put the links to some of these papers and information out down the web. But most of it comes from saying, okay, how do I look at a customer journey in how they're using my product and services, whether it's business to business or business to consumer, business to consumer, it doesn't matter. You're just looking at what is the customer journey through the products and services you're offering, and how do you actually make sure that you're doing that in the most efficient way possible, right? So that's kind of, if you look at everything that the 12 areas that are listed here in digital transformation, they kind of come into one of those areas, right? If you look at, so what happened after the lockdown, right? So that's the state of the world as it was. And now if you say, okay, what happened after the lockdown? You see digital consumption has actually gone up significantly, because they are locked down and almost everybody's sitting there and using their phones or using the internet. So this is just a snapshot reference based on a study, but it still says something that we all know to be true. If you look at your friends, family, and your bubble, everybody's using the devices a lot more, the internet connection a lot more. So you're kind of having a lot more usage of digital media. Now, why this is important is, in the end, you're providing a product or services for a consumer or for a business that is servicing a consumer. And so if your consumer and the end user is using digital media more, then the best way to reach them, you have to change the mechanism that you're working to reach them to use those digital media, right? So that's why that's kind of very crucial that while we know that that's the truth, make sure that we quantify that and as changes happen within our businesses as we kind of go forward, we need to make sure we are cognizant of that, right? And if you look at that same in a slightly different way to say, what is the business to consumer and business to business kind of adoption of digital technologies and digital channels, right? So this is about, once the lockdown, so COVID's actually increased individual consumers using their devices in the physical and the internet connection a lot more. But they're also doing that to do online shopping, to make sure that they actually go to they switch brands if the brands don't have the appropriate support for them digitally. They're actually buying groceries online, and I'll come to a use case for Swiggy as well in India, where they're actually delivering groceries, right? So there's a lot more that's happening where people are going online to do what they would have normally done through physical channels, right? But what that means and what the intent here is, if you look at the intent to continue, so if 18% of the people say they will actually switch brands, 64% of them are saying they plan to stay even after COVID, right? So even after lockdown. So that's why it's kind of important. So it's kind of one of these sticky things. So you might have heard prices are sticky downward. The price goes up, then it's very sticky coming down. Usually people don't reduce the price after you raise it up, and then people are used to paying higher prices. Usually gas or petrol and diesel is a typical example of that. Prices are sticky downward. What here it says is when you're actually having your consumers using digital channels, they tend to be sticky because they're seeing a lot more convenience in doing that. And so you'll see that kind of migrate to digital transformation, assist in digital transformation as we go forward, right? So this is, again, post-COVID, people are expecting, when they're saying retail online, 13% of the people are expecting to see a decrease in what they're doing. 23% are planning to see an increase in what they were doing in retail online, which means a net 10% will actually do more retail online after COVID. This is what these numbers mean. I mean, I'll share these slides so you can see it, and also there is the link to the actual study, and McKinsey has a whole bunch of information on COVID that's very useful to look at. It kind of is one of those things where initially, when you look at the Maslow's hierarchy of needs and we say, food and shelter, the first few things that we looked at for COVID was about, what did we have to do to make sure we were healthy? We have lemon and ginger and whatever else to make sure you're safe, and how do you make sure that you do the nasal cleaning and whatever else to make sure you're safe, right? But that's the first step. But there's a lot of information out there on how this might impact your businesses and what you're doing as you go forward. And McKinsey, Bain, most of the Deloitte and KPMG, they have significant information out there based on how they're trying to help companies kind of adjust to the realities of a post-COVID world. And it's useful to look at that to see how that might impact you. Right? One way to look at that, what I was saying so far was everything about what the market is, what the consumer is, and how the market's changing, right? So the question is, how does that impact what you're doing, right? One, there's a lot of different, abstractions to say, or models to say, how do I think about my business and what we're doing? One reasonable model is this business model canvas, which actually says, how are you providing value to your consumers, right? So what it actually says is, for a particular company or a particular organization, there are a set of key activities and key people with key partners that are providing a certain value proposition using some customer relationship. The customer relationship will be long-term, maybe short-term, maybe transactional, to the customers, and delivering their value proposition using different channels. The channels might be physical channels, it might be online channels, it might be social media, it doesn't matter, right? Different channel. And generating revenue with a certain cost, right? So this is the base, just a rough way to think about, okay, how do I think about my business and the different things we're doing? There's the same business model canvas has been extended to actually include, influencers and purchasers that buy on behalf of consumers and stuff like that. So the B2B2C model, it's the same thing, just a slight different variation to the same thing, but it's pretty much similar. But what the implication over here is what we're talking so far is the market and environment, the customer behavior change, which means that finally the people that are going to pay you money for whatever you're offering as a service or a product, right? They are changing due to the environment, due to the market, due to the current forces. And so you need to adjust to that in order to be relevant going forward, right? So what is the effect on the value proposition that you have, the products and services that you're providing to the market and for your organization is really the key question, right? So that in looking at that, you can see some specific examples as the market today, right? So if you look at Swiggy, for example, once I don't know if you guys, I'm sure you've seen all the WhatsApp messages. Right after the lockdown was lifted, there was this line for the alcohol store and the socially distant Kerala alcohol store and the Tamil Nadu alcohol store in Karnataka. I don't know if you guys saw that. It was very, very interesting to see that. Swiggy actually came up with a product to sell alcohol in 3 to 4 days after that happened. Brand new product, right? It wasn't there before, but there was a need. And obviously in some states, it's still not possible. Like Kerala, for example, even though they have a high consumption of alcohol, the government still controls the distribution of the alcohol. So they don't want any individual entity to come in and help with that. But same thing with, for example, grocery, right? So Swiggy and Zomato came out with saying, hey, I have a bunch of people that are used to delivering, and they had this problem even before. The problem was when you're delivering food, your peak of when the demand is when people eat, right? So you have breakfast, mostly not as much breakfast, but lunch and dinner. Then what do all these people that you actually have as agents do during the rest of the time? So what Swiggy is now doing is competing with Dunzo in the Genie, right? So they're saying, well, I have all these people, I have a relationship with them, and I can kind of make them do something additional. But the food market went down after COVID because, there was also lockdown. The grocery market kind of started picking up. So both Swiggy and Zomato went into the grocery market. Zomato has actually said they're not going to do the grocery market, and they're going to focus back on their food deliveries now, right? But these are examples of how the market's changing, and what companies have to do to experiment to see which, you might stick with that, you might come away from it, but you have to experiment to see if there's a product or service that actually makes sense for the market, right? There's another very interesting thing, again, related to, I think, a question that came up with Simon's conversation about agriculture and stuff, that I thought that was very interesting to a rice mill, right? So typically a rice mill, depending on the size of the rice mill, might have anywhere from 16 to 60 people to actually operate all the machinery, depending on what you're doing with bagging all the rice and making sure the entire machinery work, right? So this is one of a good friend of mine is advising a rice mill entity in Karnataka. There's actually decent turnover, but they're actually controlling the machinery using IoT devices, using things like the Airtel dongle, right, for wireless connectivity. They're using that to control the machinery and running the rice mill with a lot less people, like 3 or 4 people, than they used to do when they were actually running that. So it's not necessary that you have to have this massive change and machinery change. You can actually experiment with it, and that's what I want to kind of point out, where it's not necessarily something that is kind of that it is to experiment. That's really what we have to do to actually see if that'll get us be more efficient going forward, right? And this was in the for a rice mill. Right? Same thing with Yulu. Very interesting. So I'm sure some of you that are in Bangalore would have seen Yulu and Yulu bikes, it's for transportation. So they're kind of, saying, well, instead of you buying a bike, you can just use, motorized two-wheeler, and you can kind of take it, return it wherever you want. There are scooties like that now, but this is just the electric bikes. And once a lockdown happened, what they were trying to see is, okay, how do I stay relevant, right? And how do I actually create my business model that makes sense, right? So they're doing subscription. They're saying, well, I'll disinfect the machines, disinfect the cycles as soon as somebody goes and gives it back, so I can kind of make sure you're comfortable using it, right? Even during the COVID era. But they're also kind of doing subscription in the golf course. So there's actually videos of people using the Yulu, the bike, because you can't have caddies in the golf course now. I know Paul is I know the East Asian, caddies are a lot more, probably a lot better than having a bike to do the stuff. However, in India, you can't take a caddy now, right, because of the social distancing. So they're actually putting a golf bag in the bike and using that in the golf course, right? So just, again, is it going to be a meaningful revenue stream going forward? You don't know, right? But it's still something you're experimenting to say, can I get a revenue stream? So it's not like you don't need to do massive experiments. You need to kind of, there's a terminology in the Bay Area and Silicon Valley that says fail fast, fail early, fail often, right? So you can actually make sure that you're experimenting with something that sticks, right? Because you don't know exactly what will get the uptake, right? Especially if it's a new product service. And in the US now, curbside pickup is actually pretty big. It's actually going to be a 35 billion. The sales from that is going to be about 35 billion for retail, right? So Walmart, pretty much any store has curbside pickup that you can order, and then you can kind of pick it up. They just come and drop it in your car as you drive by, right? So it's very similar to drive-by takeaway food. In fact, there is takeaway food as well from restaurants, but this is actually pretty huge and came up after that. These are all experiments in terms of what works, and some of these will work as we go forward, right? So again, in financial services, one of the companies, I'm kind of currently involved in 3 companies. Maxwell, I'm doing legal. Typhoon, where I'm kind of advising them still on their both their online banking, mobile banking, as well as their security side. And Impulse as well. I'm still a co-founder, so it's an e-publishing solution, so I still kind of stay involved there. But in the financial services, again, very similar, right? If there's a lockdown and I can't go to the bank, right, then I need to do something to do my transactions. So if you look at what some of these people have been doing, they've actually been doing phone calls a lot more. Because if I wanted to have a personal interaction, then I would kind of now use a phone call to talk to my banker, because I can't go to the bank anymore, right, because of the lockdown. So, but a lot of the things that are changing there are about, how do I create a virtual branch, right? So can I actually have a video conference with my banker, enable that with all the regulatory compliance that is required, so I can now have a new channel and a new mechanism to meet the banker, as opposed to having to go to the bank and do work there, right? Very similar, there's voice channels, Alexa and Google integration with, the core banking system, as well as conversational systems where you can actually use AI to kind of help you with your savings goal, or help you kind of figure out what you need to do to get to the goals that you set, personal financial management and stuff like that, that you can actually do directly without going through a very set, structured conversation online and mobile. You can have an unstructured conversation with your financial institution directly through chatbots or through, AI-powered backend. IVR, interactive voice response, kind of going away. But this is again one of those examples of what's happening in the market and what you need to do to kind of make that relevant to your and finally, the one area that I wanted to touch upon that is relevant to COVID is, and in this particular case, I have a very interesting set of observations about how that works in India, right? So this is the US model, right? So, like I said, I just reflected on and realized I've been working remotely for 10 years now. So when I went to UBS, even though I had this large office, there was actually 64 different offices of the businesses in Zurich, just in Zurich alone, 64 different offices. So if I wanted to meet my customers, I had to go to their place, or they call them and meet in a common location, right? So I never really ended up going and sitting in my office, right? I was actually working remotely even for UBS. And UBS had like a whole bunch of different people in different countries, so you had to have virtual meetings, right? Right now, this is how I interact with about 150 people on a daily basis when I'm working with Maxwell or when I'm working with Typhoon. Exactly this thing. I have my meeting, I'm sitting here, and I'm interacting with them on a daily basis. Right? So it's kind of very interesting to see what happens in the US, right? This is kind of what we think as, again, COVID accelerated digital transformation of the workforce, right? So we didn't have a choice, right? We went lockdown, and then if Cheney had his manufacturing unit, he had to figure out how to make sure that he had his customers and what orders needed to go out. How do you actually make that happen? How do you fulfill your commitments? You got to figure out the way to get that working, right? So you're kind of trying to figure out what to do. In some of the other industries, like in the software side, it's much easier because you have the facilities. I mean, you can do the work remotely because you just need to have the machine. However, there's a whole bunch of cybersecurity concerns related to doing that and having the appropriate facilities to do that for everybody. When you say on one day you can come into work, the next day everybody's remote, right? So, for example, in Maxwell, there was 300 people living remote the next day, right? So how do we now get those 300 people productive when we have a whole bunch of commitments, other challenges that come up? But this the hybrid remote work models in the US, especially without having to go into the office, is huge, right? Because for example, in Silicon Valley, people would spend something like 1 hour or 1.5 hours commuting one way, right? Bangalore was like nuts, right? You spend like 1 hour, 2 hours commuting. If you go from Jayanagar to, if you want to come to ITPL, that's a couple of hours, just one way, right? So if I can take the time off and take 4 hours and save it into remote work, that's so much more useful than kind of commuting and spending the time commuting. So this is kind of some information, and some companies, Facebook and Twitter, have actually announced that they'll allow people to do remote work across the board. Google's actually saying you can go wherever you want, but they will adjust your salary depending on where you pick to go. Right? So they're not going to pay you Bay Area salaries in Kansas, Wichita, Kansas, right? Because they'll pay you Wichita, Kansas salary in Wichita, Kansas. Right? So very interesting what's going to happen and how that's going to play out. But this is some of the effect of what this whole remote work acceleration is going to be. So this is just some observations and potentially some takeaways for each one of you as you're doing this. So like I mentioned in Maxwell, when we went remote, there was 300 people we had to do remote the next day. So March, whatever, 23rd, 24th, when it said lockdown, everybody had to be remote. And you couldn't go to the office. And we said, okay, now how do we get 300 people up and running? So the immediate goal was, okay, how do we operationally make sure that we can get all our deliveries working when we have to get them up and running? So there was a whole bunch of people that had desktops, they didn't have laptops, you had to use personal machines, you had to make sure that the appropriate infrastructure was available for them to connect, right? So that was a lot of learning in terms of how you make sure you can actually get the team productive. And in fact, there's still a whole bunch of personal machines that are being used to access corporate work, just because, we had a lot of desktops, and then we had to figure out exactly how do we let people get productive. One of the key aspects of that was what you do for cybersecurity, right? So if I let a personal machine come in, then how do I make sure that I can actually protect the resources that are being accessed by that team member, and perhaps there are viruses on the machine and person. A key issue that we have to deal with, right? And one of the kind of interesting things, and you guys might want to think about, right, is it was easier to do it's easier to do remote work if you have consistent systems of record. So I'll tell you what I mean by that, right? So, for example, as a CTO for Maxwell, there's about 60, 70 people that are product development engineers that develop products and services, right? There's a whole bunch of 240 people that do services, but there's products, and the products are used by the services team to deliver value to our customers, right? But when we have that, then the question is, how do I know what we're doing, what work is being accomplished by now people that are remote, right? That I can't go and look over their shoulder, I can't see what they're doing. People that are used to kind of making sure they're giving guidance to their team members and doing adult supervision, you can't do that, right? So how do I actually make that happen? So the systems of record that we use for engineering, software engineering, very simple. We use Jira for all our issues, all our tickets, and everything's in Jira. We use GitHub for all our source, and it has to be there. Or you use Google Docs and stuff like that for saying, I'm going to share design specs and stuff like that. It has to be in one of those three. If not, you've not done work, right? Once we actually tell them, make sure people understand that, we actually just finished our yearly review, and for the first time ever, we actually, for about 60, 65 people, we never had any dispute about what was accomplished because everything's in a system of record. If it was not in the system of record, you didn't do it. Simple, right? So people can't come and say, I had a conversation with somebody. Well, I'm happy you had a conversation, but where is that documented that we can actually say, we can refer to the decisions that were made as a result of that discussion, right? It has to be in Jira, has to be in some document system. Systems of record, if you have that, accelerate your capability to do digital transformation, because you will have everything in a system of record, and then you can actually make sure you're using that to kind of to guide your work and guide the team's efficiency, right? And the same thing with meetings. So it's kind of interesting. This was my for the previous slide, right? So I meet at Maxwell. I meet 60 people on a daily basis in sprints. So I meet everyone. They have to go on video. Right? There is no question of people not being on video. So, for example, if I see a Zoom meeting like this, when we use Google Meet, but if I see a Google Meet like this, where some people are not on video, I'll say, no, you got to get on video, right? So everybody has to get on video. Very interesting results you get as a result of that, right? The insight is, what I tell them as well, if you can't do video from your place, right? How would you do work? How would you do development, right? You can't kind of do development if you don't know. Second thing is, which is actually much more interesting, is, see, in the US, I'm used to, and whenever I see anybody's place in the US, and most people in India, if they're past the manager level, they'll have a remote office, right? So this is my office. This is exactly where I do work, and I've been sitting here and doing work for 5 years, right? This is exactly where I have a meeting. But when I see my team members, and especially the freshers, they're sitting, with a lot of distractions going on. How do you do work for 8 hours? Right? So it's like that. It gives me an insight into where they are, what their issues are, and what we have to do to kind of do. This is why, for example, PayPal is actually looking at providing a desk and a chair to people that have to actually work from home. Because, if you look at, most of your professionals, your first generation professionals, right? So I come from a village in my native place is near Palin, right? Kambam Palin. I have a lot of, I go to my native place and we actually see a lot of, farmers. It's farm. A lot of the next generation for those people are actually not with them anymore. They're all engineers, right? So now let's say we shut down work and you have to go back home. And they're sitting in their dad's place, and their dad was actually picking coconuts off a tree, or looking at security for a piece of land, and they're working in different places, right? And they may not necessarily be in their paying guest accommodation in the city they're staying in, right? They've all gone to their native place. The environment to do work, right, for 8 hours continuously doesn't exist. Right. So then we can't kind of say, okay, where's the productivity? Because it's not going to happen. So I actually make everybody come on video, and if they don't have internet connectivity, they don't have machines we actually make sure we have them. The next step is to make sure that they actually have some, and we've provided chairs to some of the team members so that they actually can work more comfortably. But those are all things that you will get to see if you actually find out exactly how your team members are doing work, as opposed to, am I accomplishing something, right? So, it's not like I can then go to Starbucks and sit there and do work, right? Like that's what some of the guys in the US used to do, right? But you can't do that either. Same thing, the contingency planning is actually one interesting stuff, I don't know if you guys know, but, there's a lot of parallels that are drawn to the Spanish flu, right, for COVID. So Spanish flu lasted 3 years, 1918 to 1920. 50 million overall casualties worldwide, 20 million in India. India was the highest, right, in terms of casualties. 5% of the population in India, accounted, 5% known that perished due to Spanish influenza, called Bombay fever and stuff like that, but 5% of the people. Which means if you draw the parallels to COVID, what the contingency plan actually means, which you have to do, is you have to assume that somebody in your team is going to get sick, right? Well, we'll take all the precautions, right? I'll take precautions. I'll make sure I'm not doing this, and I'm making sure I'm washing my hand and gargling and all that stuff. But if somebody gets sick, what is your contingency plan, and how critical is that team member to your deliveries, to what you have to do? You have to know that, and you have to have the contingency plan. I see a lot of, of the 3 companies that, I kind of work with on a regular basis, the 2 of them are not doing it, and one actually started doing it, and the other 2 are starting to do it to make sure they have the contingency plan. So that's something that, you might want to think about. So that's kind of what I had in terms of the learnings from lockdown. And now I'll open it up and shut up, and I hope I'm well within my time, I think. So I'll shut up and open it up for questions and answers.
Yeah, thanks Nizar. Thanks for the wonderful presentation. That really shows where you are coming from, and how, from your perspective and the experience perspective, you have shared your knowledge. Just to officially kind of sum up whatever you have been talking, I request Prabhakar, our coordinator from Pondicherry, to give a summation and start taking the Q&A session from members and moderate the questions. Prabhakar, over to you. இன்னைக்கு நம்ம இதுல மீட்டிங்ல நிறைய industry people from different industries, US, Singapore, நிறைய வந்திருக்காங்க நிசார். And
I noticed I noticed in the previous this thing with Simon, the screen was being shared, so I'm going to stop sharing.
Correct.
Just so it's now only on video, so it becomes
you are right. Prabhakar, over to you, Prabhakar.
Thanks, Tariq sir, and very big thanks to Nizar Jamal sir, who gave a beautiful presentation on today's topic. To comprehend the topics what Nizar sir was presenting today, he was widely covering on the remote working aspects and on cybersecurity, and he gave a beautiful gentle perspective on IT solutions and different industrial applications. And towards the back end of the topic, he was touching on the operational efficiency aspects gathered, especially during this lockdown with our COVID pandemic. This presentation definitely gave a better perspective on the lines of IT to us. Sir, thank you so much for the presentation. And I would like to invite questions to be posted to the guest speaker today. Thank you. Tariq sir, questions are being posted in the chat, or is it being asked directly, sir?
Yeah, you can do both. You can read out from the chat box also, and some people are raising hands.
Yeah, who would like to pose the first question, please?
Yeah, we can unmute them and.
Yeah, Mr. Shiva, start with Mr. Shiva. You can unmute yourself and please put on your question. Please unmute your screen. Mr. Shiva Kumar, please unmute your screen. Your voice is not audible. Mr. Shiva Kumar? Yeah.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Sir?
Yeah.
Yeah. Normal working condition. Normal working condition in office environment, the cyber security aspects are put in place, assuming that you work in a particular building or in a land, local land like that. So if you want to work in remote, so do you have to upgrade your cyber security factors like firewalls and all those things in your machines in your office?
Yeah. It's a continuum. So what used to be is I used to have physical corporate infrastructure with firewalls and a network inside the company, inside the office, where I have servers, and the servers used to be accessed, and all my desktops are inside the network, and I can segregate them. That was how, about 10 years, 5 years ago, was a normal. Once the cloud started coming up and people started using the cloud and AWS, then it starts becoming that you can actually have cloud based resources instead of corporate resources. So for example, I still remember where we were using email servers, right? It used to be Exchange server. Email used to be something that used to be delivered. And then, 2000, maybe 10 years ago now, when Google Apps first came out, so Google Mail and stuff like that, all the email went to Google, right? Google's hosting it, and you're actually accessing emails there. So now it's not, all your authentication is to cloud services and cloud servers that sit out there. And even your own, applications internally, whether it is HR applications, whether it is, firewalls are actually becoming virtual. So today I can have firewalls that are kind of called web application firewalls. So you can have web application firewalls, and you can have companies like Zscaler, which are doing everything on the net. The benefit is when you have a firewall, a physical firewall, right? The physical firewall, you have to manage that with people internally, right? People that know the firewall rules and say, this is what I'm going to allow people to come in and out, and I'm going to have VPN, and I'm going to allow people to come into there. Once I start thinking of it as resources and people that authenticate to get access to those resources, and I can actually have things in the cloud, where we're migrating to is not a physical network, but a logical network. And that logical network can control. So what we're doing right now it's kind of funny. They actually told me it's connecting to the cloud server right now. That's Very interesting. It says that, maybe it's just an AI going on. But anyway, in Maxwell, for example, we have an office in Coimbatore, we have an office in Chennai, we have an office in Delhi, we have an office in Bangalore, and then in the US, right? So there were physical, servers that we used to access, but we actually moved everything logically. We are tending to move things logically, so then I can actually provide access for people to those resources without having to have them come into the company network, right? So they still have VPNs to come to company network. I still have a VPN to go into the Maxwell network if I want to, but I rarely find I ever have to, right? So I actually do most of my work outside. Most of the people in services and in product development actually do their work purely on cloud-based systems. So that migration is happening. It'll be slower. And if you don't have a cloud-based services, then it'll be harder to provide access because you have to make sure everything is controlled. The issue, there are two levels of issue. The first one is what is called the quote-unquote human firewall, right? So the weakest link in the cybersecurity chain is the person. That's what's called all the social phishing and the social attack. So I trick you into installing a file. I trick you into clicking a link and installing some random malware on your machine. Right? So you will see a lot of things in mail coming out. Do not click on this link because it's coming from a mail outside your domain and stuff like that. So there's a lot of social attacks that happen. That's a human firewall aspect. The next level is how do I actually access company resources that I want to get inside. For that, I usually create a VPN, and that becomes like a little bit more that I have to do to get there. So ideally, you want to remove that and make sure it's all services. So it's a continuum. These firewall used to be the case in the past. Now, if you're pure cloud native, then you have endpoints, machines that have appropriate protection on the machine and all resources on the cloud that you're not really having servers out there. That's the full, if you're pure digital native, that's what you would do.
Thank you, sir. Next question I'm taking from the chat box. Mr. Vishwanath has asked this particular question. Will digitalization of education become permanent? Will digitalization of education become permanent is the question, sir.
Sorry, I didn't get the question. Will digitalization depend on?
Will digitalization of education become permanent?
Yeah, I mean, so it was kind of interesting. We did my previous startup, the e-publishing startup. We did a lot of work in the entire spectrum, right? So we did work with kindergarten to 12th grade, right? We did work with colleges, and then we did work with corporate setups, right? So there are three broad sectors, right? And then there are professionals, right? Professionals like, for example, doctors, right? If you say, I am a cardiologist, and the American Heart Association actually has a set of continuing education credits you have to continue to be a doctor, for example, in the US. And right now, for example, in India, there's a lot of certifications that you go to corporate hospitals and how I'm supposed to do work as a nurse in a hospital, right? So that entire setup to actually say, there's a general trend that's happening to say, and it was a trend that was going on for moving things more online. So your, all the online courses, the Coursera's and the edX and, the LinkedIn Learning, they're all persons to get educated on, right? Those are primarily professional, but that whole thing is migrating right now to online. So almost every student is actually now doing online courses, right? And different levels. So that's going to continue, for the foreseeable future because it's just much more efficient. It was already happening with what they were calling the massively online courses, right? MOOCs. So all MIT courses available for anybody to see, right? You can actually go and see any MIT course exactly what they're doing in the past, you'll actually see that on the online side. They're making it available. The interaction you get with the professor obviously is not there. The learning that you get from, but the material is available for you, right? So how much of it you can get, how much more you can get when you have personal interaction is what the delta is that you actually.
Hey, Nizar, this is TS, providing chairs or the comfort to individuals to provide them a good environment to work, right? What is the role of HR here?
Yeah.
How do they play?
So it's kind of very interesting, right? So, it is something that HR should facilitate, should facilitate. So there's a couple of things that happen. One of the areas in remote work that I didn't touch upon was when I first did remote work, right? It was actually a little stressful, right? So this was in 95 or 96, right? I was actually working remotely for a year, and I didn't have the interaction with people in the office, and it was actually fairly stressful, right? So the first time people that are actually going COVID, forced lockdown, you have to work remotely, they will go through that stuff. And I actually have a few people in the offices that are actually going through those, little condition, right? Mentally, this is not even the physical comfort, the mental comfort, right? How do you get used to the fact that you're locked down, you're dealing with your family environment on a daily basis, and you don't have the interactions, so you're not going out to do work, right? And what will be interesting in India is whether this remote work will actually catch on across the board. But there's a physical comfort factor and the mental comfort factor. Both of those are something that HR should do. But again, it depends on how worldly wise the HR is. So what I have seen so far is, we have to kind of as leaders and the more experienced people within an organization, we have to kind of guide the HR to say, these are things that you have to do. So we have a little bit of a guidance to HR to say, these are things that you should look out for.
How do you handle it currently in your setup?
I tell the HR, this is exactly what you need to. So I see the entire team, right? So I know, for example, I have people where, they go off, so sometimes the kids come to, and see the thing. I noticed that happened in one of the windows. I don't know who, but, so they had their family members see the video as well, which happens when you're working from home, right? So that's all. It's how things are going to be if you're going to work from home. So we tell, we give instruction to HR saying, okay, we have thrice a week, we have a preparation meeting where we're looking at how do you do, what is the productivity of teams? How do you actually measure productivity of teams? And how can you actually make sure you're giving feedback to not only the team member, but also the business heads, and saying, these are how you're actually measuring stuff. We give feedback to HR to say, these are things you have to do. We do some wellness stuff, like we do the art of living courses, yoga online, so kind of have some mechanisms to actually have meetings for the entire company to come together, to actually have, just like you're around the water cooler, just having a conversation, not on a particular topic on this thing, just to meet and greet, right? So those are all things that kind of take some of those stress of being, in different locations away, but also gives you a mechanism to give feedback to HR and say, what should you do to make sure that people are comfortable?
How do you measure the productivity in the current setup? Because in an earlier environment, we see people, how they perform, how they work. But here you're not seeing them, but how do you measure their productivity now?
Yeah, so there's, so in the 3 organizations that I actually kind of currently do, like 2.5 different solutions. So I've got to look at all. So one, a little draconian solution, like the big brother watching you, George Orwell kind of thing, is there's software that actually says, on your machine, are you at the machine? Have you taken a break? What are you doing? So I can actually say, it's like almost like an industrial check-in, check-out stuff, right? You can actually do that. And I have a lot of people in the services side where, you have to do work that is interrupt driven or doing things that are, that actually do that, right? Because it's kind of a little harder for them to kind of come up with, if they're not doing it before, to come out of the project plan and stick to it and see what needs to happen. On the engineering side, what I do is very simple, right? The 3 systems of record that we have, in the timesheet that people do is in Jira. The entire plan is in Jira. If somebody says I'm working, that time is logged in Jira. So I don't care if you put that 4 hours in the middle of the night or during the day. As long as you get that done in that 4 hours or 8 hours, you said you'll get that done. And then we have sprints on a daily basis. I actually participate in those sprints as well, right? So in the sprint, if somebody is, if somebody's sandbagging, if they're kind of, so if you're going to go with a trust-based model as opposed to a metric collection model, right? So there's 2 extremes. One is I'm going to look at everything that you're doing on your machine and get the stuff. The other one is I'm going to trust you, but I'm going to call you if I think you're not doing what I think you should be doing, right? So I've done that a few times, right? So some people kind of like, sandbagging. I say, okay, I know you're doing this stuff. I'm going to give you a fair warning. And, but if you continue going down this path, it's going to be, so it depends on how you track that. That was what I put in the systems of record, right? So if somebody did work, for example, we actually tie in GitHub with the Jira. So if they say this is the bug I'm fixing or this is the feature I'm working on, I can see exactly what the check-in is for that particular issue, right? So there's no way around it. So I hope that answered your question, PS. But there are two different ways that we are currently doing it. Just depends on how much systems of record actually have that you can rely on.
Yeah, that brings to the system of records being playing an important role, because that's where you know what and who is doing what.
Right. We do that even for freshers. Surprisingly, we actually got about 45 new team members since the lockdown. Okay, so we never met them before. Right? We had to get them on board and do all this stuff totally remotely, including, we kind of said, if it's freshers, we will kind of make a call whether we want to do it or not, but mostly a little more experienced people. Sometimes the experienced people, it's kind of a double-edged sword because, if you're doing work a different way, then you have to have them unlearn what they did in the previous thing because it's not a common mechanism, right? So it's kind of a little bit of a double-edged sword. Sometimes the freshers actually pick up a lot faster in terms of how you'd like them to do work than some of the more experienced people. So
molding them is much easier.
Fine. Next question, I'll take it up from the chat box. Mr. Nizar can relax for some time in his seat because this is a big question and I'll take some time to read it out. This question is from Mr. N.P. Prasad to Mr. Nizar.
Okay, I see that. The travel, right? So this is...
Yes.
Yeah. So, yeah, definitely travel, so I'll give a slightly different perspective on the travel now, right? If you're building a new relationship, it's kind of hard to build brand new relationship without sometimes face-to-face. And actually it's more difficult. And I think it'll be very interesting to get people like Gopi's perspective on that, because from a sales perspective, that's hard, right? From a delivery perspective, they've already brought the deal in, right? I just have to deliver the stuff, right? It's easier because you're already forced into this thing where you're saying, hey, I have to have this relationship, and so it's I have to deliver to the relationship. But a sales perspective where you're building new relationship, trying to not have a transactional sale but a relationship based sale, that's going to be very difficult. And we've actually seen there's a lot of the serendipity in the meeting, like you go to dinner, or you go play golf, or you go go to the bar and kind of find out a lot of things that are happening that are outside of the work to make sure you want to do business with this person you're meeting with. That piece is a lot harder, right? But you know, if you already have the parameters that's saying I'm doing a delivery, I have to do this thing for you, and you have to do the thing, and we're kind of work together as a team. That's a little easier to do. The relationship stuff is harder. So, and again, this the lockdown and the lack of the travel has accelerated the fact that we can do a lot of meetings online. So I've had meetings with vendors where I've had a guy sitting in a pink room that happened to be his fiance's mother-in-law's room, where his fiance grew up. So like I'm looking at this video and I'm saying, "What are you sitting in a dollhouse, dude?" But it's kind of that serves the other purpose of breaking the ice. I mean, you have something else to talk about, not just work, which is really what you build relationships on. But that's what will be very useful to find out from people like Gopi, who actually build relationships on a sales thing. I mean, from an engineering perspective and a technology perspective, a little easier, right? Because I'm not the guy who's making somebody part with their money, right? I'm just making sure that they get value for their money, right? But making somebody part with their money, that's a different story altogether. I tried it for about a year. I said, that's not for me. It's not something I can make people do.
Yeah, I just want to ask the question in a different perspective. Normally, the disruptive innovation happens in the similar domain. Now, Zoom is nowhere connected to the travel. But because of the Zoom, it's a really boon for us in this COVID. So totally now, after COVID actually, there'll be a different kind of competition will arise in different domain. You understand what I'm saying? The Zoom is just but a video conferencing tool which can able to push all the travel industry, especially bigger industry like that. So what is your thought on transformation, digital transformation will bring competition more in many fields? That's what I feel, because no airline has even think of Zoom as a competitor. You know what I'm saying, where I'm coming from?
Yeah.
So that's what I'm saying.
So that's why it's kind of useful to have a model to say, what is your value, right? In the end, so it's either transactional, you're either doing something transactional, or you're building a relationship and you're working on the relationship, right? So if it's transactional, if it is you're selling a widget, right? And that widget you're selling a more expensive widget, or you're selling a less expensive widget, and it's basically price differentiated. If it's a commodity, or if it's not a commodity, and I'm building the stuff. So depending on what kind of widget you're building, you have a different kind of relationship you have with your buyer, right? If you're building a virtual sale, so if Zoom can get into the space where I would kind of look at Zoom as a mechanism, or is an enabler that is saying it's enabling people to enter my market, right? Then the question is, are they entering my market to sell widgets? Are they entering my market to sell relationships, right? And then you have to really say, what is your true value add to that, right? That's where that business model canvas, kind of mechanism helps us think through what our real value proposition is. Is our value proposition the relationship? Is it the channel that we're delivering? What are we really doing that somebody is giving us some other, something in exchange for the goods and services we are providing, right? So that's really what you have to kind of be very clear about from the model perspective.
Agree. And add-on question to the previous gentleman asked for cybersecurity. I agree with you, all the firewall, all the stuff. The moment it goes out of my domain to the public domain, Zoom, there'll be a server. People can even drop it or hack the Zoom, and even very confident information about my company. Suppose you have board meeting or kind of a review meeting or a P&L and things like that. Yeah, I understand that nobody can enter into my server. When it goes into a public domain like Zoom, that particular area of travel, still it is not very, very secure. So what is your takeaway in that?
But so there are two aspects to it. The first one is Zoom. While they do, and even WhatsApp, while they say, I have end-to-end encryption, right? And I can have end-to-end encryption and say, I have encryption where a man in the middle, somebody can't proxy this stuff and see all the traffic going through. Their claim is not the secure. There are other video conferencing solutions that are secure. So I advise one company does transcription services for medical, right? So if you're doing research and transcription services, then you have personal health information that you're potentially asking somebody in an interview, and you want to make sure that entire conversation is secure. So some of the analogies I made to him was saying, hey, if you're okay having a conversation in a crowded location, right? Then you can use things like Zoom. It's perfectly fine, right? So you're not divulging any information that you're worried about data leakage, right? So if you're not worried about data leakage, then you're fine having that conversation in a crowded location where somebody might overhear you, fine, use Zoom. If you're saying, this conversation I want to make sure I'm going to have, but I'm going to have in a room where I want to make sure that there is no chance of, just somebody overhearing it, but I've not checked whether this room is bug-free and whether somebody can listen in from the next office and stuff like that, then I can go for a little more secure stuff. If I want to make sure, I want to ensure that nobody has access to that information and only me and the other party can actually see it, then I have to have a totally different level of security in order to make sure the communication is secure. That's just in communication security, right? So there's a lot of ways I can break this, right? I can proxy it, I can do man-in-the-middle attacks, I can actually have you come to, right now when we are talking on this, and when you're talking to your server, most of the traffic is mediated by your firewall anyway. So you can actually do stateful inspection of your HTTPS traffic. So it's not something that is not, it's fairly straightforward to break if you want, if there's a determined person on the other end, right? Meaning, if I have nation state level hackers, then there's a totally different story. But if I have, somebody I'm trying to make sure the next person can't get my information, then, depending on what I'm trying to protect, I have different levels of security can actually apply to what I'm trying to protect.
Because I understand that at Zoom, most of the Asia servers are in China. So, but I believe with China rules and regulations should be transparent to them what is being communicated. So my company and the US company will have a confidential information which will pass through the server via China. There is a potential risk we have still with Zoom, right? I'm not speculating.
Usually they won't. Even if it's a Chinese company like TikTok, I don't know. I know that there was the California senator, I forget her name. She made a erroneous statement about Zoom in Chinese, right? I don't know how true that is. I know Zoom is based in the Bay Area, and I know that the guys are doing something there. TikTok, on the other hand, is based in China. TikTok as a social media and this little video stuff, they're based in China. They actually look at a lot of your traffic. If you ever use TikTok, or if your children use TikTok, ask them not to do, because basically it'll get everything from your phone, including your contacts, and send it out to China, right? That I know is that. Zoom, on the other hand, it is not secure, right? Meaning there was a whole lot of security issues, but the federal government was actually using Zoom, right? And the federal government is not going to use Zoom if traffic is going to go to the Great Firewall of China. It's not going to happen, right? So there's a lot of misconception about different things and what might go there, but usually China won't have too much traffic going in because you can't come up very easily. Google, you can't use Google services in China. You can use Yahoo in China, but you can't use Google services in China because it got blocked, right? So there's a whole bunch of things that likely urban legends. So I would take that with a grain of salt, but definitely in terms of if you want to have secure communications, how you protect them is going to be, if you're interested in that, I can pass you some information. This person, I just reviewed a thing that he wrote about research and doing secure video conferencing. So there are solutions that do secure video conferencing.
Thank you.
We will take 2 more questions maximum, considering the time aspect. Can the next question be from Mr. Muthurilan, who has raised his hand? Mr. Muthurilan, please, can you put forward the question? Mr. Muthurilan?
This is not, this is more than a question that, Nizar, you addressed about, I don't know how the building relationship section works remotely, right? Earlier today, it was, in fact, there was a FETNA happening in here, which is Federation of all the North American Tamil Association. And there was a business discussion in which one of our own alumni, Arun Murray from 89 E&I, he's the SVP of Geo here in US. So his job has been always in the last 15 years, building relationships, talking to people, vendors, customers. He brought up that and said, this has actually made it, of course, the going to the bars, meeting them, golf course, that portion is missing. But he said nowadays availability is much more to meet with the executives of other companies, and also gives at both the ends a lot more time to think, and the meetings are much more effective because the time that's being wasted in travel, stay, fly, everything has been taken off. So he said that's much more positive in this.
Yeah, but the issue with sometimes the mental health aspect related to what PS was also asking about HR and HR is saying, for the first time people, right, that actually do work from home, the separation of what is work and what is your personal life becomes very hard to manage, right?
That's true.
I have a very clear thing, I don't beyond this time, that is not work time, it's not something that I'm going to give, even if the CEO calls me, I have no way. But for usually that boundary kind of shifts, and that was some of the cause for the, some of the mental stress that people are having with the fact that, there is really no separation between work as a place you go and do work and then, what you do. And so that also causes some problems, right? So
that's very true. I mean, with the current climate, a lot of companies are taking advantage and saying, they used to say, oh, can I make a appointment with Muthu? Oh no, he's not available after 5:30 because he's going to pick up his kid. But now they are saying, oh, it doesn't matter what time it is, he'll be at home, just make it a coffee. So people started losing the time frame in terms of how much they work and how long they work.
And you should just put your foot down and say, this is it. There's no...
That's it. That's
it. This is work hours.
So we'll go with the last question from the chat box. Mr. Shankar Narayanan has asked this question. I am accessing office email in my personal phone. Is it possible to track my browsing by office people? There's a question.
So if you're accessing, so it depends on what. So are you using what is your office email? Are you using Gmail? Are you using a different email client to access your email? Is that a web service, or is it the same? Depends on what kind of service you're using. What is your email? Is it Google? Are you using Google Mail, Gmail?
Sir, can you please clarify the question, please? You're online, sir?
So I can kind of, if I don't have, in general, right? If I use a personal a phone, if I want to access corporate resource, if the company has a mechanism to say, I have a policy for personal machines accessing, personal devices accessing the company, they might have what is called an MDM, mobile device management software, that's actually installed there. So some of those things actually manage some part of your thing. There's a big movement towards having phones that have two personalities, the work personality and the home personality, and actually being able to separate the two. But a lot of it, and it also depends on using iOS or Android. Android, anything goes. iOS, a little bit better. So Apple phones, a little better in terms of privacy, security, and stuff like that than Android phones. And I don't know if you guys noticed, but the latest thing on Apple is actually some, let's say you want to buy something and then you go to another site and then you have an ad for the exact same thing coming up, right? So that is a kind of an advertising network that Apple's actually going to kill, okay? Because they're going to ask you to say very specifically, do you want people to be able to track you through different sites? And obviously you're going to say no. And so they surfaced it in the latest iOS version. But Google's not going to do that. Google's going to say, I want to track you. I know everything about you, right? So the question that you had about, whether you can track your device and what you can do, depends on your device, depends on what you're trying to do. So it kind of varies the spectrum. It's not a binary question, unfortunately. It's not a yes or no. So I'll have to go with it depends on this one. Sorry, but I'm more than happy to answer the question in more detail if you want to reach out.
Thanks.